The extraordinary consistory wrapped in Rome, and we're learning more about what happened behind closed doors. One cardinal lobbied to restrict the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass, while others are calling for more synodality and less doctrine, whatever that means. Here with insight and analysis, the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer, priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Welcome, gents. Cardinal Arthur Roche, who's the prefect of the Vatican's liturgical office, distributed a letter to the cardinals at the end of this gathering, doubling down on Pope Francis's restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass. He was almost lobbying for it. He wrote that the use of the old liturgical books, quote, was a concession that in no way provided for its promotion, end quote. Father, what does that mean? And why at a gathering of cardinals is Roche essentially allowed to browbeat the cardinals into embracing this Francis-era ban on the ancient rite of the Church, Father?
Well, that's a good question, Raymond. It's very troubling that Cardinal Roche would take this opportunity to essentially say that everything that Pope Benedict did in favor of the traditional Latin Mass, we have to forget about it. We have to, put that, as it were, on the ash heap of history. And, he says that it's a concession, but not a promotion, as if Pope Benedict just was helping a few old people and then eventually the Mass would go away. That's not at all what Pope Benedict was trying to do. He spoke about mutual enrichment of the two rites. So it's very troubling. The Latin Mass is a very popular thing. People know that. And what Pope Francis did has caused havoc and much disunity in the Church. I don't think we need any more of that. In fact, what we need is a reconciliation where the Vatican says what Pope Benedict did was true pastoral charity.
Yeah, Bob, Roche went further, claiming those who celebrate the Old Mass, quote, do not recognize the validity of the Council, end quote, the Second Vatican Council. That's quite an accusation against people who continue to fill the pews every week in many parishes around the world and are faithful to the Pope in Rome. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think he's misrepresenting the situation deeply. He's misrepresenting it in its practical terms, and he's misrepresenting it in a theological way as well. I mean, he talked about what the use of the Old Latin Mass does is it freezes divisions. This is quite a difference from what Father was just talking about, where Pope Benedict talked about mutual enrichment, where the old rite and the new rite actually interact with one another. We know that there are parishes where the two are celebrated side by side, and there doesn't seem, generally speaking, to be much of a problem. And he also goes on and he says that this is an ecclesiological question, and he's right about that, because we're talking about the continuity of the Church over time. It isn't as if Vatican II is this mega council that cancels everything that went before. And so I think that he's misrepresenting a number of the things here. He's also trying to identify the Mass that came out of after Vatican II as coming out of Vatican II. And we're now going to have a series of catechesis about the documents of Vatican II by Pope Leo. It'll be very interesting to see when he gets to the document Sacramentum Concilium about the liturgy, what he's going to say, because clearly we've said this many times on the show. What the Vatican II document about the liturgy says is not the liturgy that we got afterward.
No, it doesn't look like a lot of liturgy, most of them that you encounter in parish worship. Father, I read some accounts of cardinals coming out of this consistory. And during their exchanges with the press, one of the cardinals, I can't remember the name, but from some far-flung part of the world, he said, the consistory allows us to get back to the roots, Vatican II. Is there danger of casting the roots of the Church in the early 1960s?
Well, of course there is, because the roots of the Church go back to Jesus Christ and the apostles. So, we get into this false notion that modernity represents a rejection of everything that came up to it, then we'll look at the Catholic version of modernity as Vatican II and what followed. And the Catholic vision is not that at all. As Bob was saying, this has to be seen in the context of what Vatican II and the previous councils all said about the sacred liturgy.
Right.
And Bob's point is profound. It's legitimate to debate whether the new order of the Mass is an accurate reflection of what the Second Vatican Council fathers thought they were voting for. And I know there's a deceased now liturgist, Klaus Gomber, who wrote that the revisions in the 1965 version of the Roman Missal reflected precisely what the Council fathers wanted, which was a mix of vernacular and Latin, but essentially keeping all of the prayers and forms of of what we call now the TLM, the traditional Latin Mass. So, no, we have to look at the church as a unity and a whole, doctrinally, historically, and experientially.
Yeah, well, one could argue the traditional Latin Mass today, with the involvement of the laity who are, responding to the prayers and praying along, that is what the Church Fathers desired at the Second Vatican Council, and it certainly reflects and connects to the tradition before. Well, we're getting to that another time, but few cardinals were allowed to actually address the entire College of Cardinals. Cardinal Zen was allowed all of 3 minutes. He blasted synodality. We will spend a lot of time on this week's Prayerful Posse on the Arroyo Grande podcast. But Bob, there was a report to the college by Cardinal Fabio Baggio, and he's the head of the Vatican's Human Development Office. He defended Pope Francis's reforms of Vatican governance, claiming they marked a, quote, healthy decentralization, which leaves to the competence of the bishops the faculty to resolve issues that they know well and that do not affect the unity of doctrine. Then he claims Francis's reforms aim to give the Church the face of synodality and calls the dicasteries and offices of the Roman Curia, the Holy See, to be primarily centers of listening. Is that what the Holy See is, Bob?
Well, look, I mean, these are delicate questions, and I think we're going to have to wait to see how these things play themselves out. There clearly is a listening function in the church. It's listening to what other people are saying, but also listening to God. Let's say that is the first voice that we should be listening to. But there's also the factor of the church being a spokesman, of being the voice of God, the mystical body that speaks about what God has revealed to us. And so whether we should tie this to Pope Francis, I mean, we have to admit candidly, look, we're in a new papacy. The last years of Francis were very divisive. There was a lot of tension in Rome. And we're all familiar with Rome, the three of us. And you would go over there and you would hear complaints from people. They didn't know what they were supposed to do. Things were ambivalent. You just had this sense of this brooding tension among people. And already, I think one of the positive signs is a great deal of that has disappeared under Leo. We'll see if that continues and what direction it's going to go in, naturally. But to talk about church governance, as long as we're having this conversation, yes, let's discuss what is the role, the Petrine ministry, as John Paul II called it. What is that role? What is the legitimate role of the bishops? It cannot be, in my estimation, and I think in all three of our estimations, what we see in the synodal way in Germany, where we are departing from doctrine. But there is a legitimate way in which bishops have governance over their own dioceses. But that has to be parsed out very, very carefully. We can't just lay down this idea that, oh yeah, we've moved in that direction now and bishops have certain powers. No, I mean, this is what the future of the future of the church is going to hinge on whether we have a really dynamic working articulation of what these two sides are, the Pope on one side and the bishops on the other.
Father Baggio, Cardinal Baggio goes on to say that the reforms of Francis allows the church to respond more adequately and effectively to the missionary challenges of the time. A renewed exercise, he said, of the aggiornamento initiated in the Second Vatican Council. Does it, in your estimation?
Well, the statistics don't hold that out because the church is dying in Europe, and mass attendance in North America has declined precipitously since the close of the council. We have currently a vocations crisis in the United States that's unprecedented. The number of seminarians is extremely low. Religious life of teaching orders, for instance, we're down to a handful of sisters in the classroom. So I don't see that. And when Cardinal Baggio talks about, the Vatican as sort of like a listening center, well, how about listening not just to the bishops, but to the laity? Because the laity, as regards, for instance, the Latin Mass, they have clearly said, we want Rome to stop crushing what we find sacred. That's got to be part of this deal. And the face of synodality, again, this is entering into a language that no one can give precise definitions to. We hear that synodality means walking together and listening. Well, for me, that's taking a walk after lunch in the park with my buddies. That's not the exercise of governance and teaching in the church. So synodality is basically covering every change that's been made under Pope Francis and say, well, guess what? That's synodality. I don't know what synodality is. That's why I'm very suspicious of it.
Yeah, no, it's very odd though that yes, Bob, to pick up on what you said, we are in a new pontificate, but in many ways it feels like there's a lobby pushing to retain and extend the last pontificate. And I mean, whether by written form, these cardinals got multiple reports from holdovers from the Francis era, Roche and Cardinal Fernandez, who's head of the doctrinal office, and now Baggio, all sort of pounding, making the case for the Francis vision. They have to give way to what the cardinals want, what the church needs in this moment, and frankly, what Pope Leo sees for the future of the church. Bob, very quickly on that point.
We don't traffic in a great deal of optimism here in the Posse, but I'm going to just say that I hear from other voices, and I just read today that Cardinal Pizzaballa of Jerusalem is a very fine man. He's a very substantial man. He's in a difficult situation, and he's shown himself to be very good. He said, and I think that this is probably the general sense, that the meeting didn't produce any large conclusions, but it was a good start. It was a good chance for the cardinals to meet with one another. And I think that we shouldn't jump the gun on this. I mean, we're all nervous coming out of the trauma of Pope Francis, I think, about what is going to happen going forward. But I think we have to wait and see a little bit. It may go badly. It may surprise us. But at this point, I don't think we have a definitive sense yet.
Bob, with the note of optimism. I like it, Bob. Okay, we'll put a pin in that.
I'm a believer in the God of surprises, Raymond.
I'm just worried about some of those surprises may not be from God. But okay, I want to move on to Pope Leo's meeting with Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. She met with the Pope after winning the Nobel Peace Prize, having legitimately won Venezuela's presidential election before the Maduro regime stepped in and stole it from her through fraud. Pope Leo said the U.S. action against Venezuelan narco-terrorists and that entire state was, quote, violence never brings victory. The key is to seek dialogue, end quote. Father, your thoughts on this meeting with Machado, and should the Church in the person of the Pope be calling for dialogue with a state like Venezuela?
Well, I think we need some realism here. The United States engaged in military-assisted law enforcement action because he was arrested in order to be brought to an arraignment, which happened in my city here in New York at the federal court in the Southern District. So this was not the kind of violence that Maduro inflicted on his people. There are 8 million people who have left Venezuela as refugees under Chavez and Maduro. The violence done to that country by that narco dictator and his predecessor is immeasurable. Now, I support peaceful means, but guess what? Trump tried. We know from the public record that Trump said to him, we'll let you go to a third country and you won't have to be prosecuted, and then just got to hand over power to somebody legitimate. Maduro didn't want to do it. Maduro hired Cuban mercenaries to protect himself. So you can't deal with criminals, whether they be in the streets of a city or heading a nation, by saying, let's talk some more. Criminals always use whatever means they can to preserve themselves.
Yeah, Bob, your take on this, and this idea, we often hear about the Church's heart for refugees, many of them Venezuelan refugees, and they're worried about the human dignity of those refugees. Well, isn't this a relief to the people in their suffering in that country?
Yeah, I mean, Father's right. 1/3 of the population of Venezuela fled these two socialist communist regimes, Chavez and Maduro. I'm going to be a little bit of a stickler, and I want to think about this from Catholic social justice and Catholic social doctrine terms. Violence is always wrong. So when Leo talks about violence, he's correct. But the use of force, the just use of force, and I want to make a distinction between the idea of force and violence. When a policeman shoots somebody who's about to shoot an innocent person, he uses force. He's not using violence. And we need to maintain that distinction, or we're going to be confused about everything, because then everything is supposed to be, we sit down and we talk with people, and there are people, unfortunately, that you can't talk with, as Father rightly said. So I think that was a mistake. I think that they were much more careful in talking about what the ultimate goal of this should be, the well-being and the safety of the Venezuelan people. Now that, I think some people read that as an anti-Trump remark. I think you might give the Vatican a little bit of leeway here and say it was a diplomatic way of saying, okay, if you're going to move in and do this, the ultimate goal has to be what we all want, which is a peaceful, prosperous, functioning, free Venezuela. And if that is what the result is, and we don't know yet, there are conversations going on today, actually, over this. And I'm sure that the Pope got an earful from Maria Machado, because she knows where the bodies are buried, quite literally, in Venezuela.
Gentlemen, I want to get to the Pope's recent address to the Vatican Diplomatic Corps. It hit several themes. He warned about diminishing free speech in the West and the rise of what he called Orwellian language and a renewed zeal for war. He also lamented weak multilateralism in the international community, and he condemned the use of unilateral force by certain nations. Father, you liked, I know, the condemnation of the Orwellian speech codes.
Yes, I thought that was excellent. I think the Pope is addressing a very serious problem, which is particularly afflicting the English-speaking world and Northern Europe, which is the government using the so-called hate speech laws to suppress dissent from government policies. And it is Orwellian. When people talk about free speech and then basically arrest people because, and that's happening in England right now, where you tweet something and then suddenly you're being arrested. So no, this is I thought that was good language. Now, of course, this is where we have to say, well, truth be told, if words have meaning, then let's get the dictionary out and try to find the word synodality and give us a clear meaning of it. Because otherwise we're going to have church version of Orwellian speak. And sometimes I feel that way. If you said, for instance, people often say, well, if you're not in agreement with the synodality, then you're not a good Catholic. And you say, well, wait a minute, can't we find out what it means first before we tell people it's violating Catholic teaching if you object to what some people claim it is? So the Pope is right. Orwellian language has to go, politics and religion.
Yeah, Bob, on the other side, the Pope also called for peace and dialogue in Iran, in Syria, while rumors are swirling of U.S. involvement. We're seeing Iran's regime near the breaking point. Is the Vatican's approach here realistic, dealing with these international hotspots? Can you dialogue with the mullahs in Iran or Syria?
Well, look, we've tried this in many instances. For years and years, we've tried one thing and another with a place like Iran, and it doesn't seem to get us much of anywhere. Look, I like the Pope's speech a great deal too, and for the most part, he's talking to the diplomats accredited to the Holy See mission. I thought it was very genial. I thought it was generally speaking very good. I agree with Father that this question about definitions. We just had this absurd case in our U.S. Congress where a doctor was being interviewed and she couldn't tell whether men can have babies or not, because this Orwellian language is, we don't know what a boy and a girl is. But look, on these particular cases, you can talk about multilateralism because that sounds nice, like we're all going to cooperate and make some things happen. But we know that if there is a problem in the Middle East, or if there is a problem in Africa, or if Haiti undergoes one of its terrible earthquakes or storms hit it, what is the only power on earth at this moment capable of responding to these circumstances? It's the United States. And I've debated this many times when I've been abroad. I understand why people get nervous about this, because they know that the Colossus of the North is going to come along and do what it wants. But if you look in the Pope's speech, he talks about the UN, how lamentable it is that it's weak. And yes, it is lamentable, but it's weak. And 3/4 of the member states of the UN are not exactly states that we want to hear the opinion of. They're tyrannies, they're kleptocracies, they're just terrible places. And so what are we going to do in the meantime? In the meantime, I think we're moving toward a different international order to begin with. But as J.D. Vance said, we want a international order that includes a Europe that goes back to its founding values, which mostly means its Judeo-Christian values. A Europe that is
Right.
based on that rather than the kind of woke pieties that it's been embracing over the last few years. That is a Europe we could deal with, and we could actually make some things happen in the world. I think the Vatican has to begin to recognize that.
Yeah, but Father, you wish the Vatican would say, we need more of what we're seeing here and here and here. I mean, you've got Maloney in Italy, right in his backyard. You've got Hungary. I mean, you have examples of this Christian ethos returning to those governments or trying to. Is it incumbent upon the Holy See to sort of fan the flames of that return to a Judeo-Christian and a refounding of the roots? Pope Benedict wrote extensively about this, particularly vis-a-vis Europe.
Well, yes, and this was, remember the new evangelization that St. John Paul II started in Europe, I mean, and also the whole world, but it was primarily gauged to Europe because he, as a European, was concerned with the loss of faith. Yeah, the Holy See, obviously, the main mission of the Holy See is to promote the Catholic faith, and that's what the Pope does. And we bless him. I mean, he's doing the things that popes need to do. But we want him, in addition, to do some of the stuff that has proven successful under Popes Benedict and John Paul II to reanimate that faith. And that's why the call to clarity and truthfulness, reminded me of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. That was issued by John Paul II to answer doctrinal uncertainties. It's a marvelous document. It's done so much good in the life of the Church. So, yeah, but to basically say the left-wing European political wokeism, not a big problem, and let them do what they want. I don't think the Pope believes that, but I think there are others who do, and that's got to stop. We cannot endorse the suppression of the history of Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition, as Bob says, in Western Europe. That has to be supported.
Yeah. Very quickly, Pope Leo is planning a trip to Spain and to the Canary Islands, where immigration will very likely be on the agenda given the migration crisis there. Bob, your thoughts on the trip, given the reality we just discussed on the ground in Europe?
Yeah, I've said this before, but I'm not going to back off on saying this. I think that the Vatican is still captive to a model about immigration that no longer works in the world that we're finding ourselves in. Look, the United States is a big country. We like to talk about ourselves as a country of immigrants. We do very well at integrating people here. Legally, we admit over 1 million people a year, and we're trying to boost that a little bit because we can probably take a bit more. But the kind of inundation that is taking place in Europe by Muslims primarily, and in the UK in particular, and in France. And you mentioned, Raymond, the way that countries like Hungary and Poland and Slovakia and Czechia have got to restrict immigration because of the way that it destroys and disrupts the fabric of their societies. I don't think the Vatican has taken a measure of this. Leo keeps talking about using Islam as an excuse to be anti-immigrant. And I say again, I think this is exactly backward. If there were productive, peaceful immigrants coming in who were easily integrated, who were not committing crimes, who were getting jobs and working, who in his right mind would object to this, especially in those countries where populations are declining? So, look, again, I think that the Vatican is still a few years behind where the reality is right now. I don't expect that we'll see Leo change his tune when he's in Spain. But I think it's time for him to look carefully and hear from other people than the Vatican has been hearing from in the past.
Well, the danger there, Bob, becomes you alienate people who are suffering under this unrestricted immigration and the transformation of these European cultures. I mean, I know some of these people in Spain and in Italy even who feel that their culture is slipping from them, their future is slipping from them. Why alienate souls who need redemption and need the teaching and truth of the Church over policy that is best left to the people in charge and the elected officials? Anyway, Father, the Pope also made strong statements on life, the life issues, particularly this week calling abortion deplorable. And then he called out surrogacy, which we rarely hear about anywhere in the culture. but he said surrogacy distorts the family. Is this the clear moral voice of the Church that is needed in this moment?
Absolutely, and I praise the Pope for doing that. We need to hear more of this. Morality is people who are immoral don't want to hear about morality. People who are trying to follow the moral law, they want encouragement and strength, and that's the Pope's job. John Paul II was famous on, his foreign trips. He would bring up topics such as abortion and contraception that some people didn't want to hear about, but they need to hear about it. Morality is treated in the modern world as a choice, whereas in the Catholic faith, morality is an imposition by God of the just law to live a good life. People don't like to impose on me. The 10 Commandments are not a suggestion. They come from God. God says, do this, don't do that. So yeah, I'm pleased when the Pope echoes the moral law because we need it. We need to be encouraged to follow it.
Excellent, gentlemen. We will leave it there. And be sure to check out this week's Prayerful Posse on the Arroyo Grande podcast, where we will get really in depth on this clash of cardinals over the future of the Church at the Consistory and much more. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, thank you both. See you soon, Posse.